She said she could see me without eyes. Then her hands proved it. The diplomatic vessel touched down on the human colony with barely a whisper of displaced air, and Captain Jake Morris felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the boarding ramp extend from the alien craft, and he had seen plenty of strange things in his 15 years of service. But nothing had prepared him for the Varani. The first to emerge was their ambassador, and Jake found himself staring, because where her eyes should have been, there was only smooth lavender skin stretched across elegant bone structure, and her name was Lyra, or at least that was the closest human tongues could approximate. And she moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible. For someone who supposedly could not see, his second-in-command, Lisa Chen, stood beside him on the landing platform, and she whispered under her breath about how the intelligence reports had mentioned this. But seeing it in person was different, and Jake nodded slowly because she was right and the Varani had no eyes, and yet Lyra descended the ramp without hesitation and without stumbling, and her head turned toward them with unnerving precision. "Welcome to New Terra, Ambassador," Jake said, and he kept his voice steady and professional even though every instinct screamed that something was fundamentally wrong with what he was witnessing. And Lyra smiled, and it was a beautiful smile and warm, despite the alienness of her features. "Captain Morris," she said, and her voice had a musical quality that reminded Jake of wind chimes. "And I am honored to meet you and your people." And Jake felt a chill run down his spine because he had not introduced himself yet, and the briefing packet had been classified. Lisa shifted uncomfortably beside him, and Jake could not blame her, because Lyra was looking directly at him, or at least her face was oriented toward him, with that smooth expanse of skin where eyes should be, and it was deeply unsettling, in a way that made his primitive brain want to run. The ambassador's entourage emerged behind her, and there were 6 more Varani, and all of them shared that same eyeless appearance, and they moved with that same impossible confidence, and one of them carried what looked like ceremonial gifts, and another held some kind of scanning device, and Jake forced himself to focus on the diplomatic protocols. "Please follow me," Jake said, and he gestured toward the administrative building. "And we have prepared quarters for you and your delegation." And Lyra inclined her head gracefully and began walking, and Jake noticed that she avoided every obstacle in her path, and a loose stone and a maintenance cart and a spot where the pavement had cracked. "How do you do that?" Lisa asked suddenly, and her voice was tight with barely contained curiosity, and Lyra paused and turned toward her with that unnerving precision. "Do what, Ambassador?" Lyra asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her musical voice. "See," Lisa said bluntly, "and you have no eyes, and yet you move like you can see everything." And Lyra's smile widened, and it was not offended but rather pleased. "Ah," she said softly. "And you wish to understand?" And Jake felt his pulse quicken, because this was not in the diplomatic briefing, and they were supposed to ease into cultural exchanges slowly and carefully. Lisa flushed but held her ground, and "Yes," she said, "and if that is not inappropriate to ask." And Lyra laughed, and it was a sound like bells. "Not inappropriate at all," the ambassador replied, "and come and I will show you." And she extended one slender hand toward Lisa, and her fingers were long and elegant, and ended in what looked like sensitive pads. And Lisa glanced at Jake, and he nodded slowly, and gave her permission. Lisa stepped forward, and Lyra took her hand gently, and then the ambassador reached up with her other hand and placed it against Lisa's face, and her touch was feather-light, and Jake watched as Lyra's fingers traced the contours of Lisa's features and her cheekbones and the bridge of her nose and the curve of her jaw. "I see you," Lyra whispered, "and not with light, and not the way you do, but I see you nonetheless." And her fingers moved with impossible delicacy and mapping every detail, and I see the tension in your muscles, and I see the heat of your blood beneath your skin, and I see the electromagnetic signature of your nervous system, and I see the way air moves around you, and I see you, Lieutenant Lisa Chen, and I see that you are brave and curious and uncertain. Lisa stood frozen and her eyes wide with wonder, and Jake felt something shift in his chest because this was not just some alien parlor trick, and this was something profound, and Lyra was not seeing with eyes, but she was seeing in ways humans could not imagine. The ambassador released Lisa and turned toward Jake. "And would you like to understand as well, Captain?" And Jake found himself nodding before he could think better of it, and Lyra approached him with that flowing grace, and when she reached up to touch his face, he had to force himself not to flinch away. Her fingers were warm against his skin and impossibly gentle, and she traced the line of his jaw and the scar above his left eyebrow that he had gotten in a training accident 20 years ago, and the slight crookedness of his nose that had never set quite right after he broke it as a teenager. "You carry the weight of responsibility," Lyra said softly, and her fingers never stopping. "Their exploration. And you doubt yourself, but you do not show it, and you worry for your crew, and you wonder if you are good enough." And she paused, and her hand resting against his cheek. "And you are good enough, Jake Morris. And you are more than good enough." Jake felt his throat tighten because how could she know that, and how could she see so deeply with just a touch? And Lyra stepped back, and her expression was kind and understanding. "We evolved on a world without light," she explained, and her voice taking on a lecturing quality, and deep in the ocean trenches of our homeworld, where the sun never reaches. And we developed other senses and other ways of perceiving, and we feel the subtle vibrations, and we sense electromagnetic fields, and we taste the chemical composition of the air, and we hear sounds beyond your range, and we touch, and through touch we see more clearly than any eyes could show us. Lisa was staring at the ambassador with open fascination. "And so you are not blind," she said, and Lyra shook her head. "No," the ambassador replied, "and we are not blind, and we simply see differently. And your species relies on reflected photons, and ours relies on a symphony of sensory input that your language has no words for, and neither is superior, and they are simply different." The delegation continued into the administrative building, and over the following days Jake found himself drawn to Lyra, and not romantically, though she was beautiful in her alien way, but intellectually and philosophically, and she challenged every assumption he had about perception and reality. One evening he found her in the observation lounge, and she was standing before the large viewport that looked out over the colony, and her hand pressed flat against the transparent aluminum, and Jake approached quietly and cleared his throat so as not to startle her. "Ambassador," he said, and Lyra turned and smiled. "Please," she said, "and call me Lyra, and we are not so formal on my world." And Jake nodded and moved to stand beside her. "Can you see the stars?" he asked, and Lyra tilted her head thoughtfully. "Not as you do," she replied, "and I cannot see the light they emit, but I can feel them." And she gestured to the viewport. "And I can feel the cosmic radiation that passes through this barrier, and I can sense the gravitational fields they create, and I can detect the solar wind, and in my way, yes, and I see them." "That must be lonely," Jake said without thinking. And Lyra looked at him with that eyeless gaze. "Why would it be lonely?" she asked gently. "Because Jake struggled for words, and because you can never share that vision with anyone, and not even your own people see exactly as you do." And Lyra was quiet for a moment, and then she laughed softly. "Jake Morris," she said, "and that is true of every sentient being in the universe, and you see colors I cannot imagine, and I sense fields you cannot detect. And the engineer down in the reactor room understands forces that you and I can only grasp mathematically, and every consciousness is alone in its perception. And yet we are not lonely because we share what we can, and we bridge the gaps with words and art and touch and understanding." She reached out and found his hand unerringly in the darkness, and her fingers wrapping around his. "We are all blind in our own ways," she continued. "And you cannot see ultraviolet light, and you cannot hear the songs that whales sing in the deep ocean, and you cannot sense the magnetic field that guides birds on their migrations, and you are blind to so much, and yet you do not consider yourself disabled. And neither do I." Jake looked down at their joined hands and her lavender skin against his darker human tones, and he realized she was right. And he had spent his whole life thinking of sight as the primary sense and the most important one, but that was just human bias. The Varani stayed for 3 weeks, and in that time Lyra taught Jake and his crew more about perception and consciousness and reality than any academic text ever had. And she demonstrated how her people navigated spacecraft through touch alone, and how they painted pictures with texture instead of color, and how they composed music that humans could barely hear but could feel, resonating in their bones. On the final day before the diplomatic vessel departed, Jake stood on the landing platform again, and Lyra approached him one last time, and her movements as graceful and confident as ever. "Thank you," she said simply, and for seeing us and truly seeing us and not just looking, and Jake smiled. Thank you for teaching me how to see differently, he replied, and Lyra reached up and touched his face one last time, and